Every country on Earth is in debt. The United States alone owes $38 trillion. Globally, the number reaches more than 300 trillion. But if everyone owes money, the question becomes unavoidable. Who is actually owed? And why does this debt never disappear, no matter how many crises, reforms, or bailouts take place? This is not a warning about the future. This is a system that has already been activated, a structure built across centuries, designed so that debt is never repaid, only rolled forward. To understand why this cannot end, you have to see how it was built, step by step, by design rather than accident. Before the modern system took shape, debt was simple, limited, and dangerous for those who extended it. Before 1694, kings borrowed the old way. A monarch in need of money would approach merchants, nobles, or wealthy families and promise repayment with interest. The agreement was personal, specific, and temporary. If the king repaid the loan, the transaction ended. If he could not, he defaulted. Creditors absorbed losses. The king's reputation suffered. Future borrowing became harder or more expensive. Debt, in this world, had an endpoint. This mattered because it imposed discipline on both sides. Lenders understood that lending to a sovereign carried real risk. Rulers understood that borrowing too much could collapse their credibility. When defaults happened, the system cleared. Old debts vanished. New arrangements replaced them. There was no permanent accumulation, no endless compounding. Debt existed, but it did not define the structure of the economy. By the late 17th century, England faced a problem this older system could no longer solve. The country was at war with France. Military campaigns were expensive and continuous. The treasury was empty. Tax revenues were insufficient. Worse, England had already defaulted on previous obligations. Traditional lenders were unwilling to extend new loans. The government needed large sums immediately, but the existing financial architecture could not provide them. This is the environment in which William Paterson emerged. Paterson was a Scottish merchant and financial schemer, not a powerful noble or royal advisor. He had attempted several ventures and failed. By 1691, he was searching for a new way to profit. What he proposed was not merely a loan. It was a redesign of how governments would borrow. Paterson approached King William III with an offer. He would organize a group of wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million, an enormous sum for the time, equivalent to hundreds of millions in modern terms. But the loan came with a radical condition. The principal would never be repaid. In steer, time sabans 0.3s, the government would commit to paying interest forever, 8% annually, funded by taxes. This alone marked a break from centuries of practice. Debt was no longer something to be cleared. It became something to be maintained. But Paterson went further. To administer this arrangement, he proposed the creation of a new institution. It would be called the Bank of England. The mechanics were precise. Merchants would deposit their gold with the new bank. The bank would lend that gold to the government. Each year, the government would pay interest from tax revenues to the bank. The bank would pass that interest on to the merchants. Parliament would guarantee the payments, using the state's taxing power as collateral. The critical detail was not the interest rate. It was permanence. There was no maturity date, no obligation to return the original gold. As long as England existed and could tax its citizens, the interest would flow to the merchants. This was not a risk. It was an annuity backed by the state. They did not need their gold returned because they received something better. In exchange, they were given banknotes. These notes could be traded, sold, or used in transactions. They were effectively money, but superior to coin because they generated income. Parliament approved the scheme in 1694. The Bank of England was chartered. The gold was transferred. The government received its war funding, and for the first time in recorded history, national debt became permanent. What is often missed is why this arrangement was so powerful for those who designed it. The government paid £96,000 in interest every year on the original loan, indefinitely. Over time, the interest payments exceeded the original amount many times over, yet the principle remained intact, untouched, and unquestioned. Even more important was what followed. The Bank of England was granted the right to issue banknotes backed by the government's debt. The government's promise to pay interest became the foundation for new money. Debt was transformed into currency. The more the government borrowed, the more money could be created. This established a template that would be copied repeatedly. The government borrows. It never repays the principal. It pays interest forever. The debt itself becomes money. From the perspective of the banking system, this was an elegant solution. From the perspective of taxpayers, it created a permanent obligation with no exit. Within decades, other powers followed the same model. The structure spread because it solved a problem for states. It allowed governments to fund wars and operations without exhausting their treasuries or confronting defaults. But it also locked them into a relationship where debt could only grow, never disappear. Paterson himself did not die wealthy. He passed away in 1719. But the system he helped design did not die with us. Time, 0.15. More than 3 centuries later, the Bank of England still exists. British government debt has never been paid off. It has been rolled over, refinanced, and expanded, but never eliminated. This was the first step. Debt was no longer a temporary necessity. It was redefined as a permanent feature of the state. And once that principle was accepted, the door was opened for everything that followed. Once permanent debt was accepted, the next transformation was scale. By the early 19th century, European governments had fully embraced borrowing. Wars, infrastructure projects, and basic state operations were increasingly financed through debt. But the system was still fragmented. Each loan was negotiated separately. Interest rates varied. Access was limited to a small circle of wealthy merchants. Debt existed, but it was not yet a fully integrated system. That changed with Nathan Rothschild. The Rothschild family began as money changers and traders in Frankfurt. By the turn of the 19th century, the family had executed a strategy no one else had attempted at scale. 5 brothers established banking houses in 5 major European cities. Time, 0.5s, London, Paris, Frankfurt, Vienna, and Naples. This network allowed them to move capital across borders faster than governments and faster than rival banks. Information traveled through their private couriers, not official channels. Nathan Rothschild, operating from London, became the central figure. During the Napoleonic Wars, Britain required enormous amounts of financing. Rothschild arranged loans, but the innovation was not simply providing money. It was how sovereign debt was structured and distributed. Instead of lending directly to the government and holding the debt, Rothschild purchased government bonds at a discount and resold them to investors at a markup. This created a secondary market. Governments received funds immediately. Investors received tradable assets. Rothschild captured the spread and positioned himself at the center of the flow. This shift mattered because it changed who held the debt and how it circulated. Government bonds were no longer static obligations between a ruler and a creditor. They became instruments that could be bought, sold, and pledged across borders. Pension funds, insurance companies, and wealthy individuals could participate. Debt became liquid. Rothschild's advantage was not just capital, it was control of information. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, his courier network delivered news of Napoleon's defeat to London before official messengers arrived. Rothschild used this timing strategically. He sold British government bonds, signaling defeat. Prices collapsed as other investors panicked. Once prices reached their lowest point, he bought aggressively. When confirmation of British victory arrived, bond prices surged. The profit came not from producing anything, but from controlling timing and perception. This episode established the Rothschild model. Control the information, control the issuance, control the market. By 1820, the Rothschilds dominated European sovereign debt. Governments needing funds had limited options. The Rothschild network controlled access to investors and dictated terms. The deeper consequence emerged gradually. Before this system, a default affected a small number of creditors. Losses were contained. After Rothschild's innovations, debt ownership became diffuse and international. A British bond might be held by a French investor, sold to a German bank, and used as collateral for a loan in Austria. The chain extended across borders and institutions. Default was no longer a bilateral failure. It became a systemic threat. Refusing to pay no longer punished a single creditor. It destabilized an interconnected financial network. Governments were forced into a new position. They could not default without triggering broader collapse. Responsibility was replaced by necessity. Debt payments continued, not because governments were disciplined, but because stopping was no longer possible. This was the critical shift. Permanent debt became inescapable debt. Governments borrowed to pay interest on previous obligations. New bonds replaced old ones. The principle persisted, untouched, while interest flowed upward through the system. By the mid-19th century, the Rothschild family had become the wealthiest in the world. Their wealth did not come from factories, land, or production. It came from interest on sovereign debt. They lent to governments, structured the market, and collected payments indefinitely. The model Paterson introduced had been scaled and industrialized. Debt was now global. Default was no longer a reset. It was a threat to the entire system. And once debt reached this level of interconnection, the logic of escape disappeared. The next step would remove the final constraint, limits on how much debt governments could issue. That transformation would require a new institution, designed not to finance governments occasionally, but to ensure they could borrow without limit. By the start of the 20th century, the debt system was permanent and global, but it still faced a natural boundary. Governments could only borrow what lenders were willing and able to provide. Banks had limited reserves. Credit expansion, while aggressive, was not infinite. That constraint mattered because it imposed an upper ceiling on sovereign debt. In the United States, the financial system remained fragmented. Banks operated independently. The money supply was tied to gold. There was no central authority capable of coordinating credit or stabilizing crises. When panic struck, the system seized. That moment came in 1907. Stock prices collapsed. Banks failed. Credit froze. Businesses could not access funds. The economy slowed rapidly. There was no central bank to intervene. Instead, one man stepped into the vacuum. John Pierpont Morgan. Morgan was not a government official. He was a private banker. But during the panic, he acted as the system's backstop. He summoned the most powerful bankers in New York to his library, locked the doors, and forced them to commit their own capital to rescue failing institutions. The intervention worked. The panic ended. The lesson was immediate and unmistakable. The American financial system could not function without centralized coordination. Morgan understood this better than anyone. He also understood that relying on a single individual to stabilize the economy was unsustainable. He was already 70 years old. There would be no second intervention. What was needed was a permanent mechanism. The problem was political. Americans deeply distrusted central banks. The first and second banks of the United States had been dismantled under popular pressure. Any proposal labeled a central bank, would fail, Morgan and his associates understood that the solution would have to be hidden in structure and language. In 1910, a group of powerful bankers and political allies met in secret on Jekyll Island, Georgia. Among them were representatives of the largest banks and Senator Nelson Aldrich. The meeting lasted 9 days. The location was chosen for isolation. The secrecy was deliberate. See, if the public learned that bankers were designing the nation's monetary system, the backlash would be immediate. At that meeting, they designed what would become the Federal Reserve. The brilliance of the plan was political camouflage. It would not be called a central bank. It would be called a Federal Reserve System. It would not be a single institution. It would consist of 12 regional banks. It would appear decentralized, public, and democratic. A board of governors would be appointed by the president. But the actual control was embedded elsewhere. The regional Federal Reserve banks were privately owned by member banks. Those banks elected the boards of the regional Federal Reserves. The regional banks, in turn, selected the leadership that governed the system. While the government appointed some officials, operational control remained with the banking sector. Most importantly, the power to create money and purchase government bonds was concentrated in the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. That institution was controlled by the largest Wall Street banks, including Morgan's own network. When the Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913, many legislators did not fully understand what they were approving. The consequences were immediate. The government no longer borrowed only from private banks. It could now borrow from the Federal Reserve itself. This changed the logic of debt entirely. The Federal Reserve could create money to buy government bonds. There was no longer a fixed pool of capital. When the government issued debt, the Federal Reserve could purchase it with newly created funds. The government spent the money. The debt appeared on the Federal Reserve's balance sheet. The only backing was the promise that taxpayers would service it indefinitely. This mechanism removed the final limit. Before the Federal Reserve, borrowing was constrained by lender capacity. After its creation, demand for government debt became effectively unlimited. The government could roll over debt endlessly because there would always be a buyer. Interest payments flowed from taxpayers to the institutions connected to the system. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was established. But the structure he helped create made the modern scale of debt possible. Without time 0.3s, the market could not support borrowing on this level. With it, there was no ceiling. Debt was no longer just permanent and global. It became infinite. By the 1970s, the structure, built over centuries, was functioning across the developed world. Governments borrowed continuously. Old debt was rolled over into new debt. Interest was paid. Principal remained. The system appeared stable, but it depended on one assumption, that borrowers could always service their obligations. That assumption broke down in the developing world. Throughout the 1970s, many developing nations borrowed heavily in dollars. The loans funded infrastructure, industrial projects, and basic state functions. Interest rates were low. Credit was abundant. The risk seemed manageable, but the stability of this arrangement rested on one variable that borrowers did not control. U.S. monetary policy. That variable changed under Paul Volcker. Volcker became chairman of the Federal Reserve in 1979. Inflation in the United States was above 10%. Confidence in the dollar was weakening. Foreign governments and investors were questioning the credibility of American monetary policy. Volcker faced a choice. He could tolerate inflation and preserve short-term stability, or he could restore credibility at the cost of severe economic disruption. He chose disruption. In 1979, the Federal Reserve sharply raised interest rates. The federal funds rate moved from around 11% to 20%. the highest level in American history. Inflation collapsed. The dollar stabilized. But the consequences were immediate and devastating elsewhere. Developing nations that had borrowed in dollars now faced a sudden and massive increase in debt service costs. Interest payments tripled. Export revenues were insufficient. Mexico owed $80 billion. Brazil owed $60 billion. Argentina owed $40 billion. The interest alone exceeded what these countries could earn. In August 1982, Mexico announced it could not make its payments. Default. Under the older logic of the system, this should have forced a reckoning. Banks would absorb losses. Bad loans would be written off. The market would clear. But the scale was too large. American banks had lent heavily to developing nations. Citibank, Bank of America, and Chase Manhattan were deeply exposed. If Mexico defaulted, losses would cascade. Banks would fail. The financial system would destabilize. Volcker understood this. He had another option. Instead of allowing default, he coordinated a rescue through the International Monetary Fund. The IMF would lend money to Mexico, Brazil, Argentina, and others, not to reduce their debt, but to ensure they could continue making interest payments to American banks. These loans came with conditions. Governments were required to cut spending, privatize state assets, open their markets to foreign capital, devalue their currencies, and dismantle protections for domestic industries. Economic sovereignty was exchanged for access to credit. The key point was not austerity. It was permanence. The IMF loans did not eliminate debt. They restructured it. Old obligations were replaced with new ones. Interest continued to flow. The principle remained. When debt became unpayable, it was not forgiven. It was managed. This was the final innovation. Debt became a tool of control. Countries unable to pay were locked into long-term dependency. Policy decisions were no longer fully domestic. They were negotiated with creditors. This pattern repeated over decades. Argentina in 2001, Greece in 2003, time 0.5s, Sri Lanka in 2022. Each crisis followed the same structure. IMF intervention, austerity, restructuring, debt preserved. Volcker died in 2019, but the mechanism he helped normalize ensured that the debt system would operate globally. Even when countries reached the limit of what they could pay, default was no longer allowed. The system adjusted to keep interest flowing. Debt was now permanent, global, infinite, and inescapable. With all four mechanisms in place, the system reached its final form. What began as a method for financing wars had become the foundation of the global economy. Debt was no longer an emergency measure or a temporary imbalance. It was the structure through which money itself existed. The result is visible in the numbers. Today, global debt stands at approximately $315 trillion. This includes government debt, corporate debt, and household debt. None of it is designed to be repaid. All of it generates interest. And all of it is interconnected. Take the United States. Federal government debt exceeds $38 trillion. Of that amount, roughly $20 trillion is held by the public. Pension fund, time 0.3s, mutual funds, insurance companies, banks, and the Federal Reserve itself own treasury bonds. These institutions purchase government debt because it is considered safe. But safety does not mean free. These bonds pay interest, roughly $1 trillion per year. That interest comes from taxes. Money flows from workers and businesses to the government. The government transfers it to bondholders. Those bondholders are primarily financial institutions, managing wealth on behalf of the affluent. The mechanism is quiet, automatic, and continuous. It is not described as a tax, but it functions as one. The remaining portion of Wu or Yu, Hest and low debt is owed internally. Social Security and Medicare trust funds hold government bonds. The government borrowed from these programs and spent the money. When those funds need to redeem the bonds, the government must raise taxes or borrow more. The obligation is circular, but the interest payments remain real. The same structure exists elsewhere. Japan owes roughly $9 trillion, largely held by domestic institutions and the Bank of Japan. Europe owes around 14 trillion, held by European banks and the European Central Bank. China carries significant domestic debt held by state banks. Each country operates its own version of the same system. What connects them is ownership. Japan holds U.S. treasuries. The United States is exposed to European debt through international institutions. Europe holds developing nation debt through the World Bank and the IMF. The network is circular. Everyone owes everyone. This interconnection explains why the system cannot unwind. If the United States attempted to pay off its debt, the money supply would collapse. Government borrowing creates dollars. Repayment destroys them. Eliminating the debt would remove vast quantities of money from circulation. Deflation would follow. Trade would contract. The economy would stall. The same logic applies globally. If governments collectively attempted to eliminate their debt, the global money supply would shrink dramatically. There would not be enough currency to sustain economic activity. The system would seize. Debt, therefore, is not a problem to be solved. It is a requirement for the system to function. This raises the question of who benefits. The primary beneficiaries are the institutions that manage and hold the debt. Asset managers such as BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity control tens of trillions of dollars. They purchase government bonds using pension contributions, retirement savings, and insurance premiums. In return, they collect interest. From U.S. debt alone, the annual interest flow approaches $1 trillion. Add interest from Europe, Japan, and the developing world, and the total grows far larger. This represents a continuous transfer of wealth from taxpayers to capital. It is structural and persistent. Workers pay. Institutions collect. The debt never decreases. This is not a flaw in the system. It is the outcome of its design. 4 architects, working across 3 centuries, each solved a problem in front of them. William Paterson made debt permanent. Nathan Rothschild made it global. J. P. Morgan made it infinite. Paul Volcker made it inescapable. They did not coordinate. They did not conspire. But their solutions aligned. Together, they produced a system where governments borrow forever, money is created through debt, and the interest flows upward indefinitely. The scale of the debt is not evidence of failure. It is evidence that the system is functioning as intended. The remaining question is not whether the debt can be reduced. It is whether the system itself can exist without it. At this point, the logic closes in on itself. The system no longer needs justification, ideology, or policy debate. It operates mechanically. Every component reinforces the next, leaving no technical exit. Consider the final constraint: confidence. The system does not require governments to repay principal. It only requires that interest payments continue. As long as bondholders believe those payments will be made, the structure holds. Debt remains an asset. Bonds remain collateral. New borrowing remains possible. The moment confidence breaks, everything that depends on that debt begins to unravel. This is why the scale of debt is not treated as an emergency. $38 trillion is not a crisis signal inside this system. It is inventory. Each dollar of debt exists as an asset on someone's balance sheet. It generates yield. It can be pledged, leveraged, and used to support further borrowing. If governments were to eliminate debt, those assets would disappear. Balance sheets would contract. Collateral would vanish. Credit markets would freeze. The system would collapse under the weight of its own architecture. This is also why reform is structurally limited. Cutting spending reduces economic activity and tax revenue. Raising taxes risks political instability and recession. Default threatens systemic collapse. Inflation erodes credibility. Deflation destroys liquidity. Every path leads back to the same requirement. Time, 0.5s, continued borrowing. Debt must grow because the system is built on it. This explains the recurring pattern across history. Each crisis is framed as exceptional. Each bailout is described as temporary. Each intervention is justified as necessary to stabilize the system. But the underlying structure never changes. Debt is rolled forward. Interest continues to flow. The principle remains untouched. The system does not reset. It compounds. This is also why accountability is diffuse. There is no single actor to blame. No moment of explicit design where all elements were coordinated. Each innovation addressed an immediate problem. Financing wars, stabilizing markets, preventing bank failures, controlling inflation. Each solution made sense in isolation. Together, they formed a closed loop. In that loop, governments do not truly control monetary outcomes. They manage within constraints set by the structure of debt. Taxpayers do not directly vote on debt creation. They service it. Financial institutions do not need political power. They operate through balance sheets and contracts. The system persists because dismantling it would require accepting collapse. This is the final reality. Global debt will not be repaid. It cannot be repaid without destroying the monetary system that depends on it. Interest will continue to flow as long as confidence holds. And confidence is maintained not by repayment, but by belief that repayment is unnecessary. What was built over 3 centuries is not fragile. It is rigid. It does not bend toward resolution. It does not unwind toward balance. It expands until something external breaks it, or until confidence fails everywhere at once. That is why there is no escape mechanism built into the system. Only continuation, permanent debt, global circulation, infinite issuance, enforced repayment. Not a mistake, not a malfunction. A structure doing exactly what it was designed to do. When the system is viewed in full, the final misconception falls away. Government debt is often described as a burden, a failure of discipline, or a mistake to be corrected. But within this structure, debt is not an error. It is the foundation. Every dollar of sovereign debt exists as a financial asset somewhere else. It sits on balance sheets. It supports portfolios. It provides collateral. It generates yield. The debt itself is productive, not because it builds factories or infrastructure, but because it sustains the financial architecture layered on top of it. This is why the largest holders of government debt are not governments. They are institutions, asset managers, banks, insurance company, time 0.3s, and pension funds. Names such as BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and Fidelity appear repeatedly because they manage capital at scale. They collect money from retirement accounts, insurance premiums, and savings, and they deploy it into assets considered stable. Government bonds sit at the center of that stability. The interest payments tied to those bonds are predictable. They are legally prioritized. They are serviced before discretionary spending. In the United States alone, interest on federal debt approaches $1 trillion per year. That money does not disappear. It flows directly to bondholders. This creates a permanent transfer. Taxes collected from workers and businesses move upward through the system to institutions managing capital. The process is continuous. It does not require new legislation or extraordinary decisions. It operates automatically. Because this transfer is labeled debt service rather than taxation, it remains largely invisible. It is not debated annually. It is not voted on directly. It is treated as an obligation rather than a choice. Yet its scale exceeds most social programs and continues to grow as debt expands. This is also why no major political movement focuses on eliminating debt entirely. Any serious attempt to do so would threaten the value of the assets held by the financial system. Pension funds would contract. Insurance reserves would shrink. Bank balance sheets would weaken. The consequences would be immediate and severe. The system protects itself through dependence. At the global level, the same logic applies. Japanese institutions hold American debt. European banks hold developing nation debt. International institutions recycle obligations across borders. A default in one region propagates elsewhere. Stability depends on universal participation. This is the trap's final layer. Responsibility is distributed so widely that refusal becomes impossible. Every participant is both creditor and debtor. Every attempt to exit undermines the position of others. Cooperation is enforced not by law alone, but by structural necessity. The four architects did not coordinate across time. William Paterson sought war financing. Nathan Rothschild sought market efficiency and profit. J. Time 0.5s. Morgan sought stability and control. Paul Volcker sought credibility. Each action addressed a real problem. Each solution intensified the system. The outcome is what exists now. Debt that cannot be repaid without collapse. Interest that must be paid to preserve confidence. Institutions that benefit from permanence rather than resolution. A system where growth in obligations is treated as normal, even required. This is why the scale of global debt continues to expand. It is not drifting toward correction. It is fulfilling its role. Every crisis adds another layer. Every intervention reinforces the structure. Every solution postpones resolution while increasing dependence. There is no technical exit embedded in the design. There is only continuation. 4 architects, 3 centuries, 1 system, and everyone on Earth now operates inside it. The final truth of the system is not hidden in secret documents or closed rooms. It is visible in plain sight, repeated openly, normalized through language and policy until it feels inevitable. Debt is described as something governments must manage responsibly. Interest is framed as the cost of stability. Markets are reassured that everything is under control as long as payments continue. What is never questioned is the assumption underneath it all, that the system must persist exactly as it is. This is why $38 trillion in US debt does not trigger emergency measures. It does not prompt a plan for elimination. It does not signal failure to those who operate within the system. It signals scale. Every dollar represents an asset earning interest. Every bond represents collateral supporting further leverage. The larger the number, the more embedded the structure becomes. Confidence is the only remaining requirement. As long as governments are believed to be willing and able to service interest, the system functions. It does not matter that principal is never repaid. It does not matter that debt grows faster than economic output. Those outcomes are expected. They are built in. This is why education rarely explains debt in these terms. Citizens are taught that debt is temporary, that growth will outpace it, that discipline will restore balance. These narratives preserve confidence. They prevent panic. They keep the machinery running. But structurally, there is no finish line. If confidence were to break everywhere at once, the system would not gradually adjust. It would collapse. Asset values would vanish. Credit would freeze. Trade would contract. Governments would lose access to financing. The cost would be immediate and global. This is why confidence is defended at all costs. The system does not offer reform as an option, because reform implies reduction. Reduction implies repayment. Repayment implies contraction. and contraction threatens collapse. So the structure expands instead. Debt grows, interest flows, obligations roll forward. Each generation inherits a larger balance, framed as normal, manageable, and necessary, not because it serves the public, times harsh at 0.3s, but because the system cannot operate any other way. This is the endpoint of 3 centuries of incremental design, not a conspiracy, not a single plan, a sequence of rational decisions that converged into a closed system. William Paterson removed the endpoint. Nathan Rothschild removed containment. J. P. Morgan removed limits. Paul Volcker removed default. What remains is permanence. Debt is no longer a problem to solve. It is the environment in which modern economies exist. And as long as confidence holds, the system will continue to function, expanding quietly, predictably, and without an exit. That is the machine. And understanding that it was designed this way is the first step toward seeing power as it actually operates,